but for the home gardener, we're basically talking about 3, and then we're going to cover it all, put it all together. So first off, why do we prune fruit trees? Well, why do we prune fruit trees? What do you think?
Control and manage the growth.
Yes, control and manage the growth. For a lot of people, it means keeping the tree smaller, right? Okay, you want to improve the fruit quality, because if you prune, you get a better balance between what is growing vegetatively, all the shoots and stuff, and what is reproducing, which is giving you your fruit. You want to increase the fruit size. Now that might not be a huge thing for you as a home grower, but as a commercial grower, definitely makes a difference. And most people visually think, if you have a choice between this and one like this and it's the same variety, most people are going to go for the bigger one, right? There's just more there to eat. So that's a good thing. You want to improve light penetration, because that means you're going to get better fruit bud formation, better fruit set and growth. It increases the soluble sugars in your fruit, and enhances the color, which means it's going to taste good, but it also enhances the keeping quality. So maybe not a really important consideration for you, but if you've got a tree that's the apples are supposed to keep for a while, and you've got a family to feed, that could be a really big consideration right there. You want to improve pest and disease control, and believe me, you can do that with your pruning. And you want to control plant size and stimulate the production of fruiting wood. So that's a lot to get out of your pruning. If you're not pruning, then all of this is severely affected. Now, what to know? You need to know your buds. So we have different types of buds, and we have flowering fruit buds. Let me just see if this thing's going to work today. Does it show?
It works, but it's
Yeah,
not
there it
on
is.
the screen.
It's on the roof, yeah.
Yeah, okay, well, forget that. I'm close enough I can point. So we have fruit buds, and the fruit buds are generally thicker and fatter. Sometimes they're single, sometimes they're in something that's known as a spur or a dard. Isn't that the name for it, James? When there's a bunch of them together, and a cluster of them. And so you can generally tell them from something that's just a leaf bud or a vegetative bud. And it's important to know which are which, because fruit produces fruit at different stages. So if you have a lot of vegetative growth, a lot of leaf buds, and you keep cutting them off every year and you get a lot of new growth, that new growth is producing leaf buds. The wood has to be a few years old before it produces fruiting buds. So it depends on the age, and we'll talk about that shortly, on the age of the wood, on whether, like apple trees, generally between 2 and 4 years, but for sure on 3-year-old wood. So if you keep on pruning off all the wood and it never gets to produce any 3-year-old wood, you're not going to get any fruit. So the one fruit that likes to produce on 1-year-old wood, so that's whatever grew this year will produce fruit next year, is a peach tree. So it's always going to be producing on 1-year-old wood. So you can cut it back really hard, let it grow like gangbusters, because that's going to give you your fruit next year. But for most trees, that's not what you want. You want to have some control. And I am just so sorry that we don't have the handout, because I could, say, okay, look at this, because then you've got it in front of you. Also in the handout is the age of the different wood in terms of when it produces fruit. So I've got a slide on it, but it's also in your handout. So you don't have to remember every single thing right now. So right now what you need to remember is that fruit buds look different than vegetative buds. And that's important to know when it comes to what you're going to take off. Now, fruiting habit this is what we were just talking about, fruiting habit can influence what you're going to prune out. On 1-year-old, nectarines and peaches. Remember, a nectarine is just a fuzzless peach. It is a type of a peach. All that advertising that went into you know, people buying nectarines, making it sound like it was completely different, was advertising. It is a type of peach. So, anyway, here we are. They are going to bear fruit best on 1-year-old wood. Japanese plums, they're the big round ones, not the European ones, or the purple plums, or all the oval shaped plums. Those are European plums. They're over on this side. They produce fruit on 2 to 5-year-old spurs. But on this one right here, Japanese plums, quince, apricots as well. Apricots can produce on 1-year-old wood, but on spurs up to about 5-year-old. So they're very forgiving in terms of their fruiting. You can let them grow big and gangbusters and they'll produce fruit like crazy. They're going to look ugly as can be. They're not going to be any fun to try and prune or pick, but they produce a lot. But it would probably be better if you tried to keep the size down and kept it pruned so that you got a little more control over what's going on there. These are the ones that produce fruit on older wood. So those are the ones that you don't want to be pruning off all the time, because you need to get some older wood so that they will produce fruit spurs, because that's where your fruit's going to come. Not all fruit tree species or cultivars. Okay, a species is like apples and pears, peaches, apricots, you know, all the individual families. Then the cultivars, cultivated varieties, are the names under that. So in apples, apple is a species. Then we've got Macintosh and Spartan and Gala, and you know, the list goes on and on and on and on. Not all of them are self-fruitful. You need 2 different trees. Sometimes you even need 3. So not often that you need 3, but you know, you go to buy a fruit tree and that information isn't there. So you have to do your research ahead of time. Or if you have a fruit tree that doesn't produce any fruit and you go and you like, this tree is 5 years old, it should be producing something by now. I'll tell you that the European prune plums, they often don't produce fruit until about 7 years old. So if you've got a young tree and it hasn't produced anything yet, don't worry yet, because they're late to the show. They take a long time. Dwarfing trees often are producing a decent crop in their 3rd year. You know, they're giving you some fruit. By their 5th year, they're in full production. So that is important information. Now, you're probably going, okay, you're talking ahead of where you should be. Yes, I am, because I haven't explained dwarfing trees and all that yet. I'm just saying that this is information that you should have when you buy a fruit tree and you hardly ever get. So ask questions, because the grower provides that information to the garden center and to the nursery. They don't pass it on. They'll put the name of the variety on there, but they won't tell you what rootstock it's on. They won't tell you if it needs a pollinator. If it needs a pollinator.
It's okay.
If it needs a pollinator, and they won't tell you which that pollinator is. So let's say you get an apple tree. Most apple trees require another tree in order to get any fruits out. You've just bought one. Now what? Well, if you're lucky, the neighbor will have one that is compatible, and you will get cross-pollination. The bees are doing the job for us, and that's a good thing. Bees will travel a fair ways, so if there's another tree to pollinate with, they will, but it has to be compatible. And apples, just to confuse things, some of them are mules. A tetraploid, yes.
Just have a question. You said most apple trees. What about Red Delicious?
Red Delicious is, yes,
Okay.
about 3 years. Yeah.
No, I mean in terms of cross-pollination.
Oh, yes, absolutely. It needs a cross-pollinator.
Okay.
Yeah. The Golden Delicious is partially self-fruitful, but there are very few that are. Most of them, in order to get good fruit set, you have to have 2 different varieties, and they have to bloom at the same time, and they have to be compatible. So if you have a variety that's a really early bloomer and you have one that's a late bloomer, doesn't matter. You know, you've got 2 fruit trees, but that makes them incompatible because they're not blooming at the right time. Others are incompatible because their pollen has too many chromosomes. So if they're a mule or a triploid or a tetraploid is another name for it, they have too many chromosomes and they require pollination. So say I have a Gravenstein. A Gravenstein is a tetraploid or a triploid, whatever. A Macintosh will pollinate, but the Gravenstein won't return the favor. So then you need a third variety to pollinate the Macintosh. So it gets a little complicated sometimes. So, you know, those are things, we are so lucky now because all that information is available online. When I first started in this business, you know, nobody had ever talked to customers at a garden center about needing to have cross-pollinators, and so many people had issues with fruit trees not getting fruit, and I was answering questions about that all the time. Now people do a lot of their research on their own, and that's a good thing because it's out there. Before, I had a huge library. The reason I had a huge library is because I had no place else to get this information. I'm living in Salmon Arm. You know, we don't have huge libraries. The library was great, but there was a limit to how much they had. So yeah, check online. There are some really good websites out there. So cross-pollination is important. Japanese, if you were gonna grow one thing, I always used to say, if you only want one fruit tree, that's easy, grow a prune plum. Because it is, you know, easy. It's relatively insect prone, except now that we have spotted winged Drosophila, that has gone out the window. And it doesn't grow that big, so it's not that hard to keep under control. I love them, so I think they're really good. But you know, now, because we have spotted winged Drosophila, it's no longer the thing that I would recommend. You know, it's not any better than the others because the spotted winged Drosophila, if you haven't heard of it, is a fruit fly. But unlike regular fruit flies, it goes after good fruit. It doesn't go after fruit that's on its last legs or starting to rot or anything like that. This actually finds the stuff, you know, right before you're going to pick it. And then it has an ovipositor, which has a saw on it. And it lays eggs in the fruit. So then you pick it and you put it on the counter in the house, or you don't get to it right away. And a few days later, it's full of worms. Oh, yummy. This is not what we want. Now, the good thing is, this course is not about how to protect your fruit, but there is an easy way to protect your fruit, and that's to put up traps that catch fruit flies. And again, you can go online to find information. SWD, spotted winged Drosophila, on what you can do, because it's a big issue. It's a South Asian insect, you know, hitchhiked with some stuff, came into the United States first, then made it into Canada, eastern seaboard, eventually made it to British Columbia, and unfortunately is now also in the Okanagan and Shuswap. And yeah, it's there. You know, all those wild blackberries at the coast? They love it. That's why if you take a look, you'll see signs that say, do not take fruit from coastal areas into the interior. And you know, the signs are so small, most people don't notice them. Yeah, they are actually there because I looked for them. They are there because you are not supposed to bring fruit in from the coast into the interior because of how much spotted winged Drosophila is a problem in the wild blackberries on the coast. So, something to know. What drives plant growth? Well, we all know this in one form or another, but basically our leaves are taking up sunlight, they produce the carbohydrates, the sugars that are going to feed the plant, but not all the food comes from the leaves. Some of it comes from the trunk, the limbs, and the roots taken up from the soil. And then you have water, and water absorption is really important because it causes cell expansion and cell elongation. All of those things are necessary for good plant growth, but they have to be in balance. If you have too many leaves, compared to roots, the plant's gonna be under stress. If you have more roots than the top is made to handle, the roots are gonna grow like gangbusters to try and make the top grow, and you get a huge flush of growth, and it's all vegetative, no fruiting, right? So that you don't want either. So you want to have this balance between what's happening in the root and the size of the root with what's happening in the canopy, which is the top part. And that is how the plant grows. It's trying to even those things out. And when we prune, we actually mess with that. So that's why we have to know how to deal with it. Most people think that you prune in the winter, and that's called dormant pruning. And when you dormant prune, actually anytime you prune, you're going to change the balance between what's happening in the root and the size of the root with what's going on in the canopy. So that's what you get after pruning if you make these cuts that are shown on the cross hatches. So that's okay, but you no longer have a balance. So what's going to happen is that the tree is going to respond by sending out a whole bunch of new shoots in the spring to try and balance what's here in the roots. And the reason that that happens is that in the fall, when the leaves are dropping, the nutrients that are in the leaves are stored in the trunks and in the roots. Okay?
Before they drop.
Before they drop. Then along comes winter, and we go and prune them. Those nutrients have been stored, but then we cut off half of the buds that were on the tree that those nutrients were going to go back to. So we've got all kinds of stuff stored here, but we've taken half of the buds that those nutrients were supposed to go to and taken them off. In the spring, those nutrients have to go somewhere. So we get this huge growth response. And every year we do the same thing over, and the same thing happens the next year, and the same thing happens the next year. And what's that saying? Do you know the
Definition of insanity?
Yes, of what?
Insanity.
Of insanity.
Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. We've been doing it this way for a long time. We prune when the thing is dormant, and then we get this huge growth response, and we're looking at that all year and going, okay, I pruned the tree back. I mean, it was way smaller when I finished pruning, and now it's just as big as it was. What am I doing wrong? Well, guess what? What you're doing wrong is when you pruned. One simple thing can change that by pruning later, not pruning during the dormant season. Because whenever you prune in the dormant season, because nutrients have been saved for the following year, you're going to get a huge growth response. So all of those things that I used to teach about if you prune this is what's going to happen. Those are so important when you're pruning dormant, because you want to control how much regrowth you get wherever you can. But when you're doing your pruning during the growing season, you don't get that kind of growth response. So all of a sudden you're not playing catch up every single year and doing the same thing over and over and over again. Are you with me so far? Okay. Does this sound like, oh, this might be good? Yeah. All right. So now the tree is not having to work quite so hard to balance things out. So dormant pruning, winter pruning, is invigorating. You're always going to get this huge growth response. So regrowth is an attempt to restore the balance between the amount of nutrients stored in the trunk and the root system the previous fall with what remains of the top structure in the spring into that. Now, another thing I didn't talk about is winter pruning. Another negative of winter pruning is when you get to a certain point, minus 18 was always the one that we went with. When you get to minus 18, then you're going to cause ice crystal formation wherever you've made a cut. So you're making a cut and you're instantly causing dieback. So that doesn't make any sense. So when it gets really cold, you don't want to be pruning. So another reason why you don't want to do your pruning in the winter. One thing to remember about dormant pruning during the winter is that the more severe the pruning that you've done, the more vigorous the regrowth is going to be because there's more catching up that has to do. So what happens is that you get poor size control. Remember, that was one of our aims for pruning in the first place, was size control. So dormant pruning is not going to give you size control. The other thing is that you want to grow more fruit buds. And if you do dormant pruning, you're going to get more vegetative growth. And vegetative growth doesn't have fruit buds. So you're getting a really hairy green tree, but it's not growing fruit. So dormant pruning, again, major negatives, because those are two of your aims, and this is counter to what you're trying to do. So your pruning is negative. So if you don't want to invigorate the tree, when should you prune? And why do fruit growers prune during the dormant season?
Did you still have a question?
I have a question, yes. So, and it was related with the when you cut a branch. I suppose it depends on the tree. So I was thinking, if it's a peach, is it still -18, or it depends on the type of tree that you can cut it at 0 degrees, or it has to be at least 5 degrees above 0?
I would say don't prune at all when it's cold out, because we're going to talk about pruning during the growing season. You're no longer thinking about pruning during the winter, okay? Because I'm trying to change your mindset here. There's only one fruit that I would recommend you pruning during the winter, during dormant, and that would be late dormant, so in early spring, and that's peaches. And I'll explain to you why you cut peaches back then. All the rest of them, you don't want to prune them during the winter. Because remember that definition of doing the same thing over and over again, you know, and expecting a different result? The result, if you prune in the winter, is always going to be regrowth. Yes?
One exception to the dormant pruning rule may be your 1-year-old, 2-year-old trees that you're trying to
Yes.
get to grow to fill the space that you have.
Right.
That's the exception to that.
Yes, and thanks for bringing that up, because when you want a tree to grow, dormant pruning is effective. When you want to control size and not have to be pruning as much, then you want to be pruning during the growing season. So peaches, because they bloom on 1-year-old wood, you want to be pruning them during their dormant season because you want them to grow lots of hairy new growth, because that's where your next year's crop is going to come from. Other fruit are not like that. So the only time you want to cut them in dormant is when you want growth. And if you've got a tree that is really stubborn and it's not doing anything, then maybe that's a good, dormant pruning is going to be a good choice. But if you've already got a tree growing, then no, dormant pruning is not the answer. Yes?
Earlier you had mentioned some other 1-year-old woods were like the nectarine, Japanese plum, and quince.
Yes.
Would you recommend it for those as well as the peach?
You can do it with them.
Okay.
But if yes, especially if you've got a younger tree and you're starting with your formative pruning, if you've got an older tree, then I would do the pruning during the summertime, because an older tree is already going to have a lot more of a canopy, and in that you can prune out during the summertime. You're going to have adequate growth because you've got a good root system, so it's never going to shut down. So does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Okay. Fruit growers prune in the winter because that's when they have time.
Yeah. That's why I do it.
Yep. But it's not the best time. Physiologically, for the tree, it is not the best time to do it. Fruit growers don't have time during the summer. They've got too much else going on. So, they will sometimes do summer pruning, but then it's usually because they want to increase light penetration, to get more highly colored fruit, or they've got other reasons why they're doing it. It's not because that's when they're trying to prune. What they are doing is trying to make sure they have a decent crop. So we're talking two different things. So when you see the commercial fruit growers out there pruning in the winter, just say, oh yeah, you poor suckers, you get to do it during the cold weather. You know, I've got a better time, because we do have a better time. You can do it in shorts, you know, a whole lot better. And it will just be, they're two different situations. And hopefully you don't have 80 acres of fruit trees. There was a time, what did we have, 28,000 fruit trees? I know. It's just like, do I miss it? No. So, anyway, on. So, when you think about timing, you want to use plant physiology. So, plant physiology is how the plant grows. So, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the way the plant grows to give us the results that we want when we prune. So in the spring, you've already been, you know, other years you've been doing dormant pruning. So what's going to happen this spring? There's going to be a big growth response, right? So you are not going to do anything this winter. So next spring you're going to allow the growth response to happen, and then you are going to prune. Because at that point, the nutrients that were stored this, you know, this fall before leaf drop have been used. They've already, you know, they've gone up, they've gone into the buds that are there, and that part is done. Now you can prune, and there isn't a huge store of nutrients, so you're not going to get a growth response. Does that make sense? Okay. Also, later on, you can also prune in the summertime. And this one right here is really good for where you've got limbs, big wood that has to be done. Because your best, right here, wound closure happens most quickly when the cambium layer, that green layer under the bark, is in active growth. And that's in late spring and then again in early fall. So those are the times when you want to make your cuts, because that's when healing is going to occur the most rapidly. So if you're making big cuts, doing it in late spring after you've had that growth response already, you have limbs to take out or whatever. The only negative to doing summer pruning is that there are leaves. You can't see the structure as well as you can when it's dormant. So, you know, maybe what you have to get is get a roll of flagging tape and flag the limbs that you're getting way too many. If you could look down on your tree, you really only need 4 or 5 main limbs, because you got to get a ladder in there to pick. If you've got more than that, you've got too many. So think about which ones are the oldest, which ones are in the way, flag them, and then late spring after bud break, take them out. That will encourage new growth so that you get some new limbs eventually developing, but it will open up the tree, let in more light, more air penetration, which cuts down on diseases, and make it a whole lot easier for you to pick. Then you can prune in the summer. Now, this is not a date, this is a stage. So summer pruning happens when the new wood, the buds on the end of each branch, have become hard. You know, when they first start to extend in the spring and they're growing, they're really soft and wimpy, and you can almost just flick them off because it's all watery cell structure. During the course of the summer, as they're hardening off, it lignifies, it becomes woody. At that point, if you can't just bend it anymore, then you're at the point where you can do some pruning. Because if you do it then, it's late enough in the season that you're not going to get regrowth. Because if you do it too early, if you did it say in July and it hasn't hardened off yet, you're going to get new shoots growing. And at that point in the season, it's too late. They're not going to have time to harden off, and then you're going to get a bunch of dieback. Are you tracking with me? Okay, so it's this magic date. Late enough that the wood has hardened, that the buds have hardened, but not so, but not too early so that you get regrowth. And that means that you can go in and you can start taking out all kinds of branches, Maybe not as good for limbs, but limbs look good too. But a lot of the branches, you can do a lot of cleanup at that point, and the tree goes into the winter the same size it's going to be the next spring, because you're not going to prune it during the winter. So it goes into the winter with the nutrients that have been stored, that, you know, from the leaves before they drop. You've already cut off what you're going to cut off. So what's left goes into the trunk and the roots, and that is equal to what the size of the tree is the next spring, because you haven't cut anything off. You still following? So what that means is that next spring you'll get a bit of growth, because the roots are, you know, there's all those things that cause growth are still there. You'll get some cell extension, but you will get more fruit development because the fruit is going to get a little bit older. You're not getting as much vegetative growth growing. So now you can start to get more fruiting wood, and that's a positive. And if you do this year after year after year, now instead of having a huge growth response every year, now you've got a tree that is a more usable size, something that you control, and you can get your branches where you want and get your fruit production where you want, instead of having all that hairy growth. How many of you have a big old, you know, apple tree with all the water sprouts on the top? Okay. The reason they produce all those water sprouts is because growth wants to go up. And when you have, the roots have been gotten all these nutrients stored the previous fall, then you come along and you cut a whole bunch off, those nutrients have to go somewhere. And because they want to go up, you get, and there isn't a vent or a central place for all that growth to go to, which is something that we try to get into trees that we're training now. But when they were training them open center, those big old trees, there was no place for that growth to go. So it went like this. And every year people would go and they'd cut them all off. And then instead of 1, now there's 4. Next year there's 8. Next year there's, you know, before long you have 20 on each one. And it's just a mess. And that's, again, that whole definition of expecting something new by doing the same old thing. So there is a better way to do it. So these 2 times for pruning, we're not thinking dormant pruning at all. We're talking about late spring after bud break, and then in the summer after the new growth is hardened.
So in that case, that of the apple, that grow the branches up, then it's better to do it in the summer prune?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but if you have one of those trees, it's going to be challenging, and I'll talk about it. Hopefully we have enough time to talk about all this, because time is marching on. So pruning causes wounds. You want to keep your wounds relatively small. They should be limited in number, so you never want to take off more than 1/3 in a year of your total tree. So don't ever think that you're going to do, oh, that tree is a mess, I'm going to do a major renovation. No, because you're going to get a huge growth response. Again, just think about nutrients stored where it has to go. So no more than 1/3 per year. You should cut cleanly, which is why you need to have good tools. You should prune when wound closure is going to be most effective. We've talked about that. And do not use wound dressings. They sell them, but you don't want to use them. What happens is the moisture under the wound dressing actually causes rot. And in most cases it's been found to be very detrimental. So don't use wound dressing. The tree will look after itself. Trees have been doing that for millions of years. They don't need our help. So they know how to do it. Now, timing in terms of what you're taking off. There are 4 Ds when it comes to pruning, and if you remember these, you can get most of your pruning done. And it's easy. It's an easy thing to remember to take out into your garden. You're taking off anything that's damaged, anything that's diseased, and anything that's dead. They can come off anytime. You don't have to wait till the summer. If it's dead, it's not coming back to life. If it's diseased, it can cause problems. It needs to be gone. And if it's damaged, again, it can be a spot for infection to come in and take over your tree. You need to get rid of it. So damaged, disease, dead, anytime. Then there are the deranged, and I say they can come off anytime too. Yeah, most people have 3Ds. I added a fourth because there's this whole group of things that doesn't fit in here. So deranged is anything that's growing in the wrong direction. So in our, where you've got 2 leaders, or you've got a branch coming like this, and there's one that just goes up like this. Well, or it goes down like this. They're going in the wrong direction. Get rid of them. There's nothing that you can do that is going to improve them, and they don't need to be in the tree because they're not going to do much of anything. If you have double leaders, or if you have a sharp crotch angle. Now, crotch angles, when you go shopping for a tree, when you're looking at branching, if you put your finger right down into, where the branch meets the trunk, if you can see light when you put your finger in there, that's a sharp crotch angle. What you want is you want to be able to bring your finger right down in. Reason why sharp crotch angles are not a good idea is because they're weak. And they're weak because ice can collect in there, detritus, leaves and stuff can collect in there, and then a limb will break. So just not a good option. Get rid of it. So, you want to have the strongest tree possible. So you want to have nice, strong crotch angles so that your tree will grow over a period of years. If you've got a tree that is out in the lawn or something and it's always in the way when you're mowing, if there's a branch that's, where you always knock yourself, get rid of it. And if there are rubbing branches, get rid of them. In everything, if you were to look down at it from above, you should be able to look at a central leader, like the hub, and everything comes off of that evenly. If you've got things that are crossing over, yeah, you're going, oh my gosh,
Have you seen our trees?
No, I haven't. So, anyway, but this is what you want, right? So now, one of the first things that you're going to do is take a look at your tree, and you're going, oh, there are rubbing branches. If you take care of all of these right here, you haven't even started on any other pruning, but you've taken care of almost everything that has to come out right there. Makes it really easy. You remember the 4Ds, yes.
Just to clarify, the deranged is anytime as well? Just the deranged?
You can do them
as
anytime.
well? Okay.
Yeah, you can wait until you're going to be pruning, but if there's a serious issue with any of them, they can come off anytime. But definitely the first 3. This one depends on whether or not there's an issue. If there's an issue, get rid of it. If it can wait until you're doing your major pruning, then wait until that. The 4Ds of pruning are basically information that you can very easily take with you out to your tree and get rid of those, and then after that you can stand back and look at your tree and go, what else has to come out? Remember the 1/3 rule. You don't want to take out more than 1/3. Often by the time you've taken care of this, your 1/3 is up. So there's nothing else you need to do. So at that point, remember, trees are really forgiving. They probably are not going to, you don't have to do anything else. And if you have a really overgrown tree, you don't do it all in 1 year. You do it over a period of years. So for those of you with the big overgrown trees, yes, it doesn't happen all at once, or you're going to get a huge growth response. So plant physiology, that apical dominance that I told you about, we already use this. Every time you've got a house plant or a garden out in the garden, or a plant out in the garden, and you nip the growing tip out of it to make it branch more, that's getting rid of the apical bud, of the apex bud, which is the top one, right up here. Every branch has an apical bud. The strongest one is the one in the top, because that one controls what happens as you go down the tree. So apical bud, most people, are not realizing that they're working with apical dominance, but we use it when we're growing plants of all kinds, and we use it when we're fruit growing as well. Trouble is, when they were doing the fruit tree training, where they were doing the big open center, like the tree that you have, they weren't considering it, and because they weren't, that's why all those trees are big and hairy. that and the combination of doing the pruning in the wintertime. So if you take off that bud, then the buds that are below it are going to start growing, as you can see in this illustration right here. So what you end up getting is a bushier, fuller plant, but not necessarily smaller, because a lot of that is determined genetically. So apical bud, there are two different hormones, for goodness sakes. There are two different hormones, the one that comes from the apex or from the apical bud or the terminal bud, the words are all used interchangeably, comes down from the top. Every side branch, that bud also produces same hormones that are coming down and they're going down to the root, because that is going to grow your roots. It doesn't want to grow a lot of top, but there's another hormone. Yes, this one's better. The other hormone that is produced in the roots is called a cytokinin. It goes up. And the cytokinins are all about growing top structure. That's all they want to do. They just want to, find a bud and make it grow. The auxins, on the other hand, are going, but not so fast. You're growing way too fast. We need to have some control here. So the auxins come down outside of the cytokinins, and they kind of hold them in place. And they control the fact that not everything is going to grow like crazy all the time. Now the auxins that are produced in that terminal bud are brought down to the roots by gravity. And they are favoring not the growth of the tree, but of roots. The cytokinins are produced in the roots. They go up and they're all about producing buds and shoots. So why this is important is because you need...
When you remove the auxin by taking off the top bud of the branch, you take away the growth control, and the cytokinins then blow out the side branches and create all kinds of shoots.
Yes. Did you all hear that?
The auxins are like a condom on your branch.
You know what? I have used that illustration and I thought, no, I'm not going to do that this way. And then you go and do it. Oh, too funny.
It works. They are holding this together, and apical dominance is there because the cytokinins are blowing out the tip and the growth occurs on the top. So the apex is dominant, it's growing.
Okay.
And so when you cut a branch, 1-year-old branch, you're saying, okay, cytokinins, blow those
Buds. James, do you want to come to the front? Because then your voice might carry better that way. Would that be okay? Please?
I do have a quick question about that, because typically, when you remove like the apical, am I saying it right, apical bud?
Yep.
It'll often split like right at that source.
Yes.
And so with trees though, are you saying that the whole branch would then go lateral, or does it stay true where just where you cut it, it splits?
What happens is that the buds directly below it then grow. So you take off the terminal bud, and the one right below it is fairly weak, but then you go down the next 4, they're really strong. So then you get huge shoot extension. So you might have had something, you take off the bud, and I have a slide about this, so maybe I should just go ahead and show you. All right, we'll get to that in just a moment. Limb angle, because the auxins that are produced in the terminal bud have such an effect on what's happening, are also affected by how upright the branch is. So the more upright it is, the more the auxins are controlling the buds down below. You get rid of that,